You've probably heard the expression, if you like sausage, don't watch it being made. This week we're going to take a little twist on that statement. If you don't like federal tax laws, you should watch how they're made. It's going to be a simple and humorous explanation of how federal tax laws are made, why they often seem to make no sense. You still may not like the results, but you might feel a little saner after we help take some of the mystery out of the process. I'm your host, Nick Papakyrikos. I'm a CPA, a business advisor, and a wealth manager with Papakyrikos CPA, professionals based here in Boston, Massachusetts. But we help businesses, individuals, and families reach their full potential all across America. And while we work with a wide range of clients, we have a particular concentration in auto repair and body shops, real estate businesses and investors, consultants, and high net worth or soon to be high net worth individuals. Here we talk about topics you want to know about. We explain them in easy to understand and interesting ways, and we help move you closer to reaching your business and financial goals one step at a time and one episode at a time. We do have an important disclaimer. The information provided in this podcast has been gathered from sources that we deem to be reliable and that represent our general opinion regarding the topics discussed. Before taking any action on the information discussed herein, you should speak with us directly about how this information applies to your specific circumstances and the pros and cons of any actions you might take. I also want to thank our sponsors for a moment here. Steer CRM, the Steer CRM platform, helps auto repair shops acquire new customers and drives existing customers back to the shop for regular maintenance and service. AutoShopAnswers.com, the auto industry disruptors is what I call them. In my opinion, the best automotive training program in the United States. Training is led by auto repair industry veteran Todd Hayes, who also serves as the Chief Operating Officer of Adams Automotive, and focuses on helping all repair shop owners understand the concept behind the $1 million per month shop, Adams Automotive in Houston. How do they do it? By changing the way auto shops do business. If you own an auto repair shop and you want to be the place that people rave about to their family, friends, and on social media, and are financially successful beyond what you are today, you owe it to yourself to attend. The course is offered monthly in Houston with limited seating. Registration is always open for upcoming classes held once a month at AutoShopAnswers.com. If you don't sign up, trust me, your competition is. Don't get left in the dust, get into the pole position. And Papakyrikos CPAs, your partners in success, where we offer proactive advice you can understand and want to follow, and fixed fee pricing. Speaking of proactive advice, I had a prospect recently ask me, is it too much to expect my CPA to provide me with ideas and advice? Seems like every time I come up with an idea, it's because a pop-up showed up on my phone, my hairstylist or my lawn care person suggested it to me, or just one of my friends mentioned it at a get-together. Well, the short answer is no, that's not too much to expect, and unfortunately, it isn't provided in so many cases. When we say proactive advice, it's based on the fact that all of our service plans are based on continuing involvement with you, getting to know you, your business, what your goals are, what challenges you face, and what your plan of success is.
Woo, you sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee, but I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will, but today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." Then he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee, and I'll sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be a law. I hope and pray that they will, but today I am still just a bill.
All right. Some of you may recognize that from the Schoolhouse Rock series. It's the way that most young Americans learned about the Constitution when they weren't in school and about the process of making bills in the 1970s. I am proud to say that I can still recite the preamble to the U.S. Constitution because of one of their Schoolhouse Rock episodes on that subject. So I've linked both I'm Just a Bill and the preamble to the Constitution on our links on the webpage. You can find it on TikTok, YouTube. It'll bring you back down memory lane if you're my age. If not, if you want a simple understanding of how a bill becomes a law, I can't think of a better one. Whoever came up with that series really had a knack for teaching complicated things in a simple way. So, I'm Just a Bill. Little song explains in very short order how complicated it can be for legislation to become law. And this was written over 50 years ago. Today, if you had a song that would describe the process, it's probably far more similar to the Beatles' Helter Skelter than it is sort of sane, rational, I'm Just a Bill song. So what we're going to do this week is talk about how tax bills, tax laws are created. There's a process called reconciliation. You'll hear this word from time to time. We're going to talk about how it works, how it produces laws that don't seem to make any sense sometimes, and here, as we will over the next 6 months, all the cliches that people usually spout. We're in reconciliation season right now. The House has just passed a reconciliation bill. The Senate will now debate theirs, and at some point they'll come up with a solution. So I want to take this in 3 pieces. One is, how does a bill become a law? Real simple. The usual process is the House of Representatives votes on a bill. If they like it and they pass it, the Senate goes and looks at that bill. If they like it and they pass it, then it goes off to the president who signs it and it becomes law. Now that almost never happens in that order, but that's the process. Now, why does this process break down sometimes? Well, in the Senate, you've sometimes heard the expression a filibuster. Well, in the Senate, you need more than just one more vote on the yes side than on the negative side to pass a bill. They refer to this as the filibuster, which means you really need to have, out of the 100 U.S. senators, 60, not 51, but 60 votes saying yes to pass a bill. And as the world becomes more politicized and people become more dug in on their points of view, it isn't hard to imagine that this stops an awful lot of legislation from ever happening, and it grinds the gears of progress and legislation in Congress to a halt. So a little history lesson. When I first got into this business in 1986, the Tax Reform Act of 1986 was the big topic of the day. It was a brand new law. It was the first time the tax law had been greatly revitalized in 30 years. Now, there were a lot of changes. There were changes that both sides of the aisle could live with. The big one was lowering tax rates significantly. The other one was getting rid of deductibility of rental losses. Back at that time, people would buy into rental property deals that would create losses that would offset their other income. So you'd have situations where very wealthy people making a lot of money, would own rental real estate, usually through some kind of an investment partnership. And these partnerships would produce losses, largely from depreciation, meaning not cash losses. And those losses offset the income of very high income people. I used to work for a firm that did a lot of those types of audits of those organizations, and it was always interesting to see some of the well-known names that were buying into these deals. And this was perceived as an abuse. It was the abusive provision or treatment of the day. So it was a major change when that happened. And this happened because even though people were still partisan back then, they were able to come together after enough bluster and talk about whatever they thought was important. And the interesting thing is to hear what some pretty well-known high-up people in the Democratic Party said about a bill that was so significantly pro-growth. So Ted Kennedy, probably the most liberal Democratic senator in the United States Congress when he was alive, my senator for many years of my life. He was quoted as saying, when this Tax Reform Act of '86 passed, quote, "Today we are making history. We are putting the economy on the right track. We are reforming the tax code in a way that is fairer and simpler and will benefit all Americans." The Speaker of the U.S. House happened to also be from Massachusetts at the time. His name was Thomas P. Tip O'Neill. You may know him now as the namesake of a tunnel that goes through downtown Boston, but he actually was a real person who was in Congress, Speaker of the House. He said when this bill passed, "We may not agree on everything, but we both agree that this is good for the American people." Now, I can't remember the last time I heard either party say something like that, and it's a sign of the times, and this is why, as legislation becomes so hard to pass, this process known as reconciliation was created. Now, it's been around since the 1970s, but it hasn't become as popular as it has in the last 25 or 30 years because of what's happening. So what does reconciliation mean? The simplest answer is it just means that instead of having 60 votes of yes in the Senate, you only need 51 votes. So you have fewer obstacles. You don't have to get as many people behind a bill. You just have to have a simple majority. Now, think about what happens when a lot of legislation is passed. Many times you'll hear people say things such as, we want to pass this bill, but there have to be offsets. And offsets is just a fancy way of saying if something is going to cost the Treasury $1, there has to be something else in the legislation that recovers that $1, either in a fee, a tax, a penalty, or whatever. That's the concept of bills paying for themselves. Well, reconciliation looks something like this. The Congress people get together and they say, how much of a hole can we blow in the budget to pass some tax laws? Now, that may not make a lot of sense to you, so think of it this way. Imagine the Congress people are a bunch of high school kids, and their parents have decided, we're going to go away for the weekend. And the first thing these college kids and high school kids get together is say, well, how big a party can we throw while our parents are away and not get into too much trouble? Now, reconciliation, as it relates to tax bills, usually covers a 10-year period. So imagine your parents were going away for 10 years, not for a weekend. How big a party could you have if they weren't coming back for 10 years? You'd have enough time to clean up the house. Heck, you'd have enough time to rebuild the house if you had to. This is what reconciliation is. It's Congress people saying, all right, the restraints are off. We can go spend a whole boatload of money. It's like a big Christmas tree. Let me find ways to put my ornaments on and do the things that'll get me reelected, or less cynically, just do the things that I think are needed to be done. So they agree on this big number. We can spend $800 gazillion trillion. Think of it as a big pot of money, and now everybody has their ideas of how to spend it. I like to think of it as this big pot of money. Think of it as a clown car at a circus. Clown cars, for those of you who've been to circuses, know there are a million clowns in the car, but also what you'll see is they all have to get into the car. So as many clowns as possible try to squeeze into the car, and by the time this thing is at the end of its life, you'll have people hanging off the roof, hanging off the running boards. You'll see somebody on the roof with a foot inside the window of the car, barely in the car, but they fit in the car, so they're counted as being in the car. Well, this is what reconciliation is. Congress people trying to stuff as many things as they want into this little pot of money in this one chance they have to do it. So, as you can imagine, now that we have this clown car being built, there's an awful lot of funny math that gets involved here. The funniest math that politicians seem to practice is that they, for some reason, think that people don't change their behavior based on the laws that they enact. It's like saying if we raise taxes, it doesn't have any impact. They like to look at this pool of money and they say, well, if we cut taxes by 10%, then we're going to get 10% less money in the federal budget. That means we've already used this amount of money in our big pool with our big pot of money. Now, we know this is silly. I mean, the easiest way to look at this is if somebody said tomorrow that the tax rate is now going to be 100%. In other words, you go to work, you get paid $10, and you're going to pay $10 in taxes. 100% of your money is going to be taken by the government in taxes. It doesn't take much imagination to realize that probably very few people would actually work in that point in time because they're not going to get to keep the money. The flip side is, let's say the tax rate was 0%. It isn't hard to imagine that a lot more people would be working or working harder or longer or taking more risks because whatever money they earn, they get to keep and use as they see fit. Well, along with this silly argument that people don't change their behavior come a lot of cliches. You'll hear them a lot now and you'll hear them for the next 6 to 9 months. Cliches such as the other side wants to cut tax rates. They want tax cuts for the rich at the expense of the poor. They'll say 98% of the tax cuts go to the wealthiest people in the country. Now, we've heard that statement so many times, most of us don't stop and think about what that means. It just becomes background noise, and if you believe one side of that argument, you believe it probably very strongly, and if you're on the other side, you probably believe it equally strongly. But where does that statement come from? What it comes from is if we are going to cut taxes by 10%, people who make $1 million, 10% is going to be $100,000. That means in this weird world where nobody changes their behavior, $100,000 of our pot of money is going to people who make $1 million or more. Okay, but also when they raise taxes, they don't say, we're raising taxes by 10%. You don't hear those same people say, well, the vast majority of these taxes are being paid by the top 1%. Now, you'll hear people say things like the rich should pay more, but they never come out and say, we're raising taxes and most of this is going to be paid by people making more money. It's the same concept, it's just the reverse. But people like to make their arguments and they like to say things like that. That's where that whole argument comes from. You'll hear things like fair share. We want to make, in this case, the rich pay their fair share. Well, if you've ever taken a look at the statistics from the Internal Revenue Service, from public data, some insanely unbalanced amount of money, I can't even quote it to you off the top of my head, but it's well over 90 to 95% of the income taxes are paid by less than 5% of the population. So think about that for a minute. We need $1 billion to run our country, let's say, and 95% of that is going to be paid by 1% of the population. Now, does that sound inherently fair? You may say, well, they can afford it. Well, maybe they can, maybe they can't. But I don't think that you could say it's fair in terms of spreading the burden. Well, problem is, when they talk about the rich not paying their fair share, the obvious question is, well, how do you define rich? One person may say rich is somebody who makes $1 million a year. To somebody else, it might be somebody who makes $100,000 a year. And to still somebody else, it might be somebody who makes $50,000 a year. Needless to say, it's from your perspective. And when politicians and people start making the argument about somebody else should pay more, they need to be careful, because sooner or later, that little level of rich is going to keep coming down, and someday it's going to be pointed at you. So we're not going to succeed by dividing ourselves against fellow citizens. The idea of most economic growth is to enact policies that grow our economy in such a way that anybody who wants an opportunity to succeed has a fair share to do that. Now, within this bubble, within this pool of money, the clown car that we have, all of our politicians are going to be spouting out various ideas over the next 6 months. Many of those ideas were spoken on the campaign trail in our most recent presidential race. I'll give you some examples. Donald Trump made a point of saying that he wanted no tax on overtime or no tax on tips. Well, think about that. How many people work overtime, or how many people make tips? It's a lot of people. I don't know what the number is, but it's a lot of people. Well, if you wanted to say, let's say there's 1 million people in our example who work and get paid tips. And because there's so many people, even though each person might not make a huge amount of money, 1 million people making $50,000 a year ends up being a lot of money. So this tax cut idea is going to take up a big piece in that clown car, a lot of the room in that clown car. And whether or not it'll grow the economy, hard to say. There's pros and cons to it. But the point is, that's what we would call a very expensive idea. And that means that if it takes up that much room in the clown car, there isn't enough room for other things. What are some other examples? The president is also talking recently about making interest on auto loans deductible. It used to be 30 years ago, before that Tax Reform Act of '86. Well, there are an awful lot of people who have auto loans, and if they could deduct the interest on that loan, that would be a big number, because, again, so many people have car loans. So, again, another big clown has gone into that car. What are some other ones? Tax credits for children. Now, I had 4 children. Nobody would appreciate tax credits for their children more than somebody like myself. But, again, the concept is a lot of people have a lot of children. It's 1, 2, 5, 10, whatever it is. If there's a $3,000 per child tax credit, that number is going to get very big very soon. And now there's another big clown going into the clown car. Pretty soon you can see there's not a lot of room for things that are designed to grow the economy. Well, the other side of this coin is that politicians will then say, well, okay, this car is getting pretty crowded right now. Let's add a second deck to it. Their way of doing that is by creating new taxes or new fees or new penalties. I talked last week about some states trying to tax the sin tax items, gambling, cigarettes, alcohol. These taxes also exist at the federal level. Politicians can enact penalties on certain things. Over the last 20 years, the penalties for not filing 1099s have gone from being very small to pretty expensive right now. The penalties are designed or should be designed to encourage compliance with the law. But sometimes these penalties also seem curiously large, and they coincidentally happen to fill the hole in this budget solution. They make just enough room so one more clown can get into that car. So even after all this shuffling, getting as many clowns into the car, there's still going to be some clowns sitting on the outside that can't get in. So how do the people that control a clown car try to make that work? Well, they say, okay, clown number one, we're going to chop off one of your legs. And the clown says, well, hey, how am I going to be a clown? I can't hop around and do my tricks with just one leg. I'll be a pretty boring clown. The rest of the clowns say, we don't care. Well, how does that relate to tax legislation? This is where some of the really seemingly stupid and senseless ideas come into play. 2 years ago, Congress passed laws to change some of the due dates of tax returns. And I won't bore you with the details for the reasons, but the point was a lot of these dates changed. Now, when these dates change, that means the money that comes in when these tax returns are filed come in at different points in time. Federal government has a budget, works on October 1st through September 30th. So when they're doing this reconciliation clown car that has to fit over 10 years, they're measuring it on revenues and expenses from October 1st through September 30th for the 10-year period. Well, just so happens that some tax returns are due in October, extended personal returns and some other things. Well, one of these changes was enacted. They changed the way when certain corporations had to file their tax return. They changed the rules so that it was going to be September 15th for most corporations, but for one type of corporation, a C corporation, they said it's going to be October 15th. Well, whenever they change these rules, they always create these transitional rules that say how you convert slowly. Well, because September 30th is the end of the fiscal year, and anything that costs revenue that goes beyond that date, like this October 15th deadline, really plays havoc with their numbers. So they came up with these really complicated rules and said, if you do this, you do this, you do this, you do that. And what it ended up being was most people that had these C corporations, their returns are due October 15th, but there were a handful that had to be due in September 30th, I think it was. Didn't make any sense if you were trying to figure the rules out. If you're a business person who knows when you normally have to file your return, all of a sudden the rules change for reasons that don't really make much difference to you, and your friend and your colleague who is filing in October, you have to file in September. Now that's all eventually worked itself out, but it's an example of some of the weird things that happen as they try to stuff more clowns into this car and what they have to pull out. It's also why many of these laws expire. As I've said before, there are many tax provisions that were part of the Trump tax bill that will expire at the end of 2025. The reason they expire is if you made this rule permanent, it would cost more money. It would mean a bigger clown goes into the car. So they say sometimes, well, this is going to be the law, but it's going to stop at the end of those 10 years, or it's going to stop halfway through at 5 years, so that we have a little bit more room for one more clown to come into the car. They will also make some rules gradually slow down. So there are these rules on depreciation called bonus depreciation, which are very good for spurring businesses to buy things. At the beginning of the Trump law changes, you could write off 100% of this equipment in 1 year. Over the course of the 5 years, this provision went from 100% to 80% to 60% to 40 to 20. So gradually became less and less. So if you're a business person planning on when you buy assets, you have to really know, how does this schedule work? So again, if you think the concept and the policy is good to allow this bonus depreciation, why not keep it permanent? Why reduce it? They reduce it because they have to make the numbers work. So again, you have a decent sized clown car, and our politicians try to make it a little bit bigger. They try to put a few more clowns in. They try to chop off some legs and arms from some of the clowns to make this thing fully packed, busting at the seams. And eventually there's a tax legislation that the president figures they can sign and the House and Senate figure they can vote on. And you get, hopefully, something that's pretty useful. What are my hopes? Well, the Trump tax bill, which was the last major piece of legislation, was so different from the one in 86. And by that I mean, in 86, there was a lot of consensus that cutting tax rates will grow the economy, and it did. This last round of tax cuts, the top tax rate went from 39.6% to 37%. That's not a huge change. There were a lot of changes that were, let's just say, less than amazing. And it always struck me as, wow, this legislation is very, very different. Its impact on growth there is some impact on growth, but it's very different from what the last, quote, major tax legislation and reform change had encouraged or had created. So I hope this helps you understand a little bit about what's going to happen over the next few months as legislation is discussed and debated. And when you come across some really weird ideas, remember, they're trying to stuff a few more clowns in that clown car, and they're doing whatever they can to make it work, and they don't necessarily care that it might not make sense or it might catch somebody by surprise. So keep that in mind. On the way out, we're going to end with our Helter Skelter song from the Beatles because, as I said, most of the time, that's what legislation being made looks like. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
When I get to the bottom, I go back to the top of the slide. We'll stop and turn 90